There are few jobs in history that sound more humiliating, and yet more strangely intimate, than the man whose duty it was to wipe the royal bottom. In an age of swords, cathedrals, and chivalry, when kings demanded obedience and nobles carried themselves like miniature gods, there existed one humble figure whose power came not from armor or inheritance, but from a towel, a basin of water, and the quiet trust of a monarch on the privy. It sounds absurd now, but in the courts of medieval Europe, wiping was serious business, an affair of etiquette, loyalty, and delicate precision. From rough moss and river stones to perfumed silk, and the earliest attempts at toilet paper, the story of how humans have cleaned themselves after doing their most private deed is one of civilization's strangest mirrors. For what better way to measure human progress than to see what we've used to wipe away the evidence of our humanity? Tonight, we'll wander through the centuries, through the marble latrines of Rome, the paper factories of Ming China, and the perfumed privy chambers of Tudor England, to discover how a simple act of hygiene became a symbol of power, intimacy, and social class. So, get comfortable, my sleepless listener, dim the lights, and imagine for a moment a flickering candle beside a velvet-draped stool, and the whisper of footsteps belonging to the man whose royal duty was to make sure His Majesty's bottom was clean. Long before thrones existed, there were pits, rivers, and wide-open fields. The first humans, wrapped in animal skins and shivering under stone skies, used whatever nature offered: smooth river stones, handfuls of grass, tufts of moss, or when nothing else could be found, simply snow. Hygiene was not a matter of luxury, it was a matter of survival. The goal wasn't comfort, it was simply to keep the flies away. Archaeologists have found evidence from Bronze Age settlements, suggesting that the earliest toilets were nothing more than shallow trenches with water channels carved through clay. Yet even then, there must have been a moment, silent and awkward, when a man reached for something nearby, a stick, a leaf, a clump of fur, and decided it would do. That moment, in all its simplicity, was the beginning of human sanitation. By the time of ancient Greece, people had begun to take wiping seriously. In Athens, citizens were known to use small rounded pieces of pottery called ostraka, fragments once used for voting, now repurposed for wiping. Some historians believe this recycling carried an extra sting to soil the name of one's political enemy, quite literally. These shards, smoothed by handling, were about the size of a cookie, and you can still see their edges worn down by use, testament to a civilization that valued democracy and marble statues, but not necessarily comfort. The Romans, never ones to shy away from engineering or excess, took the concept to another level. Their public toilets were vast, echoing chambers of stone benches, each with dozens of round openings. Beneath ran a channel of water that carried away waste, and for cleaning, a shared sponge on a stick, dipped in salty vinegar, or running water, used by everyone in turn. Imagine it. The marble floor cold under your sandals, the air humid and sour, with the scent of oil lamps and humanity, a neighbor chatting casually as he passed you the communal sponge. Hygiene was not private, it was public, social, even philosophical. The Stoic thinker Seneca once wrote of a man who took his own life by swallowing that same sponge stick, a grim end, and perhaps the first recorded case of death by disgust. In distant China, by contrast, the approach was more refined. Records from as early as the 6th century mention the use of soft paper for personal hygiene, long before Europe even dreamed of it. The Tang and Ming dynasties elevated wiping to an art form, producing perfumed paper for the imperial family, thousands upon thousands of sheets each year, cut to precise size, and sometimes soaked in aloe. For the emperor's household, cleanliness was a matter of dignity. For the commoner, it was simply paper, thin, grey, and coarse. And yet, the innovation was revolutionary. While the rest of the world was scraping and rinsing, the Chinese had already discovered the luxury of softness. By the late Middle Ages, the act of wiping had transcended mere hygiene. It had become ritual, etiquette, and for a very select few, a career path. Inside the candle-lit corridors of England's royal palaces, amid the rustle of silks and the murmurs of courtiers waiting for a glance from their sovereign, there was a small, discreet room whose importance few dared to underestimate. It was called the Privy Chamber, and it was, quite literally, where the king conducted the most private affairs of state. Here, the walls were lined with tapestries to muffle sound. The floors were covered with thick rushes and lavender to disguise the scent of humanity. In the center stood a peculiar piece of furniture, part throne, part box, part mystery, the close stool, or what we might, less glamorously, call the royal toilet. It was often carved of oak, padded with velvet, and fitted with a chamber pot of polished pewter or silver beneath the seat. And beside it, always standing ready, was the man known as the groom of the stool. Despite the unflattering name, his duties went far beyond wiping. He was not just a servant, but a confidant, the keeper of secrets, the gatekeeper to the royal body itself. Only he could attend to the king during his most vulnerable moments, removing the heavy layers of velvet and brocade, holding out fresh linen, and ensuring that nothing, not even a loose fold of fabric, came between the monarch and his dignity. It was said that to be trusted with the king's backside was to be trusted with his soul. The groom of the stool knew everything: the king's moods, his habits, his weaknesses, even his digestion, and in the silent intimacy of that chamber, more truths were whispered than in any council room. Henry VII formalized the position in the late 1400s, creating what he called the Privy Chamber, a new department of the royal household, separate from the ceremonial court. Here, behind the curtains, the king could escape the crowded public rooms and surround himself only with those he trusted absolutely, and at the very center of this miniature world stood the groom, towel in hand, armed with both water and discretion. One of the earliest men to hold the position was Hugh Denys, a man of respectable birth and unshakable loyalty. He began as a humble attendant, but rose through the royal ranks to become the keeper of the privy purse, essentially, the king's personal treasurer. The same hands that once prepared the royal chamber now counted the king's private gold. Power, it seemed, could take the most unexpected shapes. The groom of the stool became more than a servant. He was an advisor, a gatekeeper, a man through whom access to the king flowed. Nobles began to court his favor, knowing that one whispered word from him could open the doors to influence. In a world where every glance and gesture could shift the balance of power, even wiping had become political. When Henry VIII inherited the throne, the position became almost sacred. His groom, Sir William Compton, was not merely a cleaner but a companion in everything from hunting to council meetings. He was by the king's side in the field, in the chapel, and yes, even at the stool. When the king travelled between palaces, the groom rode ahead to ensure that every royal privy was prepared, the chamber properly curtained, the linen perfumed and folded. To be the groom was to move with the king's shadow, unseen, indispensable, and ever present. To outsiders, the job seemed demeaning. Yet within the gilded web of Tudor politics, it was one of the most powerful posts a man could hold. No ambassador, no noble, no bishop could approach the king without passing through the quiet approval of the man who attended him on the privy. It was said that the groom wiped more than the royal backside. He wiped away the ambitions of those who displeased him. The irony was almost divine. The lowest task had become the highest trust. To kneel before the king not in ceremony, but in sanitation, that was true intimacy. And in the strange world of monarchy, intimacy was currency. The groom of the stool lived in luxury, often granted estates, pensions and titles. He dined better than many lords, had his own servants, and received gifts from nobles eager to curry favor. And when the king was in good health and good mood, the groom's life was one of quiet privilege. But when the king suffered digestive troubles, and they often did, given the royal diet of spiced meats and sweet wines, his duty became far less enviable. Yet, even in those moments, there was something curiously human about it all. The idea that beneath the crown, the silk and the divine right to rule, a king was just another man in need of a helping hand. As Europe stumbled from the filth of the Middle Ages into the fragile dawn of the Renaissance, cleanliness slowly transformed from a matter of survival into a symbol of refinement. To be clean was no longer just to avoid disease. It was to rise above one's station, to prove that one's body, like one's soul, was cared for and controlled. And so, even in something as ordinary as wiping, the walls between rich and poor grew higher and far more perfumed. For the peasants, life was practical, raw, and relentlessly physical. Their toilet was often nothing more than a wooden bucket or a quiet patch of earth behind the cottage where the wind carried away embarrassment. Afterward, a handful of straw, dry moss, or a torn scrap of linen would do the job. It wasn't pleasant, but it worked, and it could be burned after, the medieval equivalent of a flush. In winter, when snow fell thick over the thatched roofs, many peasants found it the cleanest, coldest, and most immediate solution nature could provide. Those who lived in towns used chamber pots, emptied each morning into the streets below. Imagine the sound, the window shutters creaking open, the splash of waste hitting cobblestone, and the shouted warning of Gardy-Loo echoing down the alley. For the poor, sanitation was communal. For the rich, it was concealed behind curtains and servants. Inside the manors and palaces, wiping became ceremony. The wealthiest families commissioned craftsmen to carve elaborate close stools, ornate wooden chairs with padded lids and gilded hinges, upholstered in velvet or brocade. Some even had embroidery stitched with family crests, as if to say, our lineage extends even to the toilet. A silver basin stood nearby, filled with rosewater or vinegar, while perfumed cloths were stacked neatly on a tray. Afterward, servants would carry away the waste as discreetly as priests handling relics. By the 1500s, this small domestic routine had become a kind of theatre of hierarchy. To sit upon one's stool was to quite literally take the throne, an act of control over the body, and symbolically, the world. Kings sat on elevated seats, lined with silk. Nobles sat on polished wood. Peasants squatted over pits. Cleanliness had become the new crown. Yet, despite all the luxury, the rich were far from hygienic by modern standards. Palaces were often thick with odors, a mixture of incense, wine, damp wool, and humanity. Even Henry VIII, that grand master of opulence, had rooms filled with sweet herbs and lavender, simply to mask the smell of his court. Servants scrubbed the rushes daily, replaced straw mats, and scattered flowers, but the air itself told a truth no perfume could hide. The Tudor palace might glitter in candlelight, but it still stank of men. Among the nobility, scented water and fine linen were signs of sophistication. Imported soaps from Italy and Castile were stored like treasure. For wiping, soft fabrics were reserved for those who could afford to discard them, often squares of linen or wool, sometimes rinsed and reused. But for the majority, comfort was improvised. In France, coarse hemp was common. In rural England, dry reeds or handfuls of hay sufficed. And in monasteries, where modesty was sacred, monks used strips of wool cloth, washed each week in the icy rivers that curled beneath abbey walls. There was also symbolism in the act itself. Cleanliness was purity, both spiritual and physical. A noble who maintained a fragrant chamber was seen as morally upright. A peasant who smelled of labor was seen as sinful by association. It was a cruel illusion that scent could measure virtue, but one that shaped centuries of European life. By the 17th century, as indoor plumbing began its hesitant march into existence, the connection between sanitation and status became unbreakable. Architects designed private closets, not only for prayer but for bodily relief, small candlelit rooms with carved doors and discreet drains, reserved for the privileged few. Even the word privy, meaning private, revealed the growing divide between those who could conceal their humanity and those who could not. And yet, for all the silks and perfumes, one truth remained unchanged: no matter how noble the birth, every backside was mortal. Beneath the embroidery and the etiquette, everyone was still bound by the same simple, undignified necessity. In that truth lay something oddly democratic, a quiet reminder that the mighty and the meek shared at least one thing in common, even if they did not share the same toilet paper. By the end of the Tudor Age, the world was changing faster than the scent of rosewater could mask. England was drifting from medieval intimacy toward a new age of manners, bureaucracy, and plumbing. The court, once small and personal, now swelled with diplomats, scribes, and guards, and the once sacred privilege of attending to the royal backside began to lose its peculiar importance. The groom of the stool, that most trusted of servants, who once held both towel and influence, slowly found his duties reduced, sanitized, and ultimately replaced. Under the Stuart kings, the title survived in name, but the task itself had changed beyond recognition. No longer did a man kneel with basin in hand. Instead, he arranged garments, managed the royal wardrobe, and supervised personal attendants. The stool had become symbolic, the wiping metaphorical. In this transformation lay something deeply human. As the monarchy sought to appear less flesh and more divine, the physical realities of kingship were quietly erased. The body of the ruler, once tended to with intimate devotion, became hidden behind layers of ceremony and lace. Kings no longer wished to be seen as men who ate, sweated, or relieved themselves. They wished to be icons painted in oils, untouchable, odorless. And so, the groom's real duty faded into legend. During the reign of King James I, the position was filled by men of considerable standing, sometimes nobles in their own right, chosen more for their lineage than their willingness to handle linen. They carried keys to secret drawers and letters instead of towels and water bowls. Their duty was to manage petitions, deliver messages, and guard the king's privacy in the political sense, not the physical one. The intimacy that once defined the office was now only a ghostly echo behind its title. But history has a way of romanticizing what it no longer understands. Centuries later, Pamphlets and historians would whisper scandalous tales about the royal wiper, imagining him as a jester or servant stooping at the king's knee, when in truth, the role had become one of trust and discretion, an early blend of secretary, aide, and best friend. As plumbing improved, the royal stool itself evolved from a portable box to a more permanent chamber fitting. By the 18th century, royal architects had begun designing private washrooms with hidden pipes, porcelain fixtures, and clever valves to flush waste with water drawn from cisterns above. The invention of the water closet, first a curiosity then a luxury, quietly ended one of history's strangest professions. No longer would a man stand by with towel and vinegar basin, ready to cleanse the royal person. The job had literally gone down the drain. The Victorians, with their obsession for propriety, sealed the final nail in the groom's perfumed coffin. What had once been whispered about became unmentionable. Cleanliness, once a private art, became a public virtue. Soap advertisements filled newspapers, and plumbing engineers became the new heroes of domestic life. The royal body, now fully hidden from the world, existed only in portraits and parades, its basest needs confined to pipes, drains, and polite silence. And yet, the idea of the groom of the stool never quite died. It lingered in the collective imagination, that strange mixture of humility and power, service and influence. It spoke to something eternal, the paradox that those who serve most intimately often stand closest to power. For behind every crown, there has always been a hand unseen, sometimes holding a sword, sometimes a quill, and sometimes a towel. By the time Queen Victoria took the throne, the groom had been replaced by modern attendants and personal secretaries. The stool, once lined with velvet and guarded by titles, had become porcelain and pipe, and though the court still had grooms and pages and keepers, none would ever again enjoy the peculiar privilege of tending to the royal rear. So ended one of the strangest chapters in royal service, a profession that began in ancient clay pits and ended in marble bathrooms, having passed through every phase of human dignity along the way. When the 19th century finally learned to flush, humanity quietly crossed a threshold it didn't even realize existed. For the first time in history, the business of cleaning oneself no longer relied on moss, cloth, or the loyalty of a servant. It relied on a mechanism, a handle, and a roll of paper hanging neatly on the wall. The old chamber pots, once carried down corridors by half-asleep servants clinking with the sound of embarrassment, were replaced by porcelain bowls that gleamed like sculpture. Plumbing spread through the cities like veins beneath stone, connecting homes to an invisible network that carried away shame and smell alike. It was as though civilization itself had decided that modesty deserved its own system of pipes. But it wasn't just about technology. It was about dignity. For centuries, the act of wiping had been a private ritual of survival. Now it was reborn as an expression of comfort, hygiene, and even class. Those who could afford indoor plumbing prided themselves on it, boasting of tiled bathrooms and nickel-plated taps the way their grandparents once bragged about chandeliers. To have a flush toilet was to be modern, to have, in a sense, domesticated one's own humanity. And then, in the middle of this new age of sanitation, came a man named Joseph Gaiety, a New Yorker, with an unlikely dream. In 1857, he began selling sheets of medicated paper for the water closet, claiming it prevented hemorrhoids and other unfortunate ailments. Each sheet was soaked in aloe and stamped with his name, a flourish of pride in a business few dared to advertise. Gaiety had no idea he had just created one of the most profitable industries in modern history. Within decades, the humble roll of toilet paper became a household symbol. Clean, white, endlessly soft, and in its own way, revolutionary. Companies raced to make it gentler, thicker, more luxurious. The industrial age had found its most unexpected goldmine, the art of comfort in the smallest room of the house. Meanwhile, the working class still relied on what they had. In rural America, outhouses were stocked with newspapers, catalogs, and even dried corn cobs, anything that could serve the purpose. The Farmer's Almanac, printed since 1792, became so popular in outhouses that the publisher began pre-drilling holes in the corner of each copy for easy hanging. It was perhaps the only book in history meant to be both read and reused. Across the Atlantic, the English were slow to adopt the new invention. For many Victorians, paper still felt extravagant for such a private act. Some preferred to use squares of old newsprint, which they hung from hooks in the garden privy. The well-to-do might have perfumed their paper with lavender or rose essence, while the poor simply made do with yesterday's headlines. But whether one lived in a palace or a coal miner's cottage, the ritual was finally the same. No grooms, no servants, no velvet stools, just a quiet moment of human equality behind a closed door. The 20th century turned that equality into an empire. As advertising boomed, the toilet roll became a symbol of domestic purity. Companies gave it smiling mascots, jingles and slogans promising heavenly softness or luxury for your skin. Factories refined pulp until it felt like silk. Designers wrapped it in pastel colors and printed delicate patterns, as if to disguise its purpose entirely. By the mid-century, toilet paper had become so central to modern life that shortages caused panic. In 1973, when a late-night comedian joked about a possible paper shortage, American stores were emptied by dawn. People hoarded rolls like treasure, proof that humanity had finally elevated wiping into an obsession worthy of the ancients. And today, the industry continues to innovate with the same fervor once reserved for cathedrals and kingdoms. There are quilted rolls, scented rolls, rolls infused with aloe, coconut oil, even vanilla. Some come in designer packaging, others are perfumed with rhubarb and plum, as if intended not for a bathroom but a spa. The ritual of wiping, once brutal and public, has become luxurious and private, a daily ceremony of softness, convenience and control. Yet, behind all the branding and comfort, the act itself hasn't changed at all. Humanity still kneels before the same simple truth that has followed it since the dawn of time, that no matter how rich or poor, refined or rustic, king or peasant, everyone in the end must deal with their own humanity. It is humbling in a way to realize that civilization's greatest triumph might not be the printing press or the steam engine, but the quiet dignity of a clean, comfortable behind. And perhaps that's what makes this story so strangely beautiful. From marble thrones to porcelain ones, from moss to perfumed paper, from grooms with golden basins to factories that roll 1 million sheets an hour, it is all part of the same uninterrupted human story, a story of need, invention, and the small comforts that keep us civilized. So tonight, as you sit in the warm light of your own century, remember this history was not built only on battles and crowns, but also on basins and towels, on privacy and plumbing, on the timeless desire to feel clean, body and soul. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, humanity entered what could only be called the age of sterility, a time when the pursuit of cleanliness itself became a kind of faith. The bathroom, once the smallest and most forgotten room in the house, transformed into a temple of self-care, tiled, scented, softly lit, and engineered for comfort down to the last mechanical click of a dispenser. It was no longer enough to be clean. One had to smell clean, look clean, appear untouched by the slightest trace of biology. The advertisements spoke of freshness as if it were a moral virtue, pure, renewed, invigorated. Bottles of disinfectant stood beside candles that promised serenity, and what had once been a daily routine of necessity evolved into a ritual of identity. In some strange way, we had finally come full circle, returning to the same delicate theatre of image and scent that medieval kings had once performed behind their velvet curtains. Only now, instead of a servant with rose water, we had brands and slogans selling bottled perfection for $6.99 a spray. The modern toilet itself had become an object of quiet reverence. Engineers spent decades perfecting its design, streamlining the curve of porcelain, adjusting the angle of the seat, even refining the sound of the flush, so that it whispered rather than roared. In Japan, the process reached a kind of technological enlightenment. Heated seats, built-in music, motion sensors, and digital bidets that sprayed, dried and deodorized with machine precision. Some models even played gentle chimes as if to serenade the human act of being human. Gone was the humble sponge stick of Rome, the frozen snowball of medieval winter, or the linen towel of Tudor intimacy. In its place stood chrome buttons, scented air, and polite silence. Humanity had wrapped its oldest instinct in layers of engineering, automation, and shame. In the West, the toilet paper industry became an empire of competition. Brands fought to out-soften one another. Quilted or triple-layered, aloe-infused or lotion-soaked, recycled or ultra-pure, every roll promised not just comfort, but class. Some were marketed as cloud-like, others as gentle as a mother's touch. The message was always the same: you were refined, you were cared for, and your body, even in its most private moments, deserves luxury. But beneath the comfort, something deeper stirred, a quiet unease, the kind that has haunted us since the first humans crouched in the dirt. For all our progress, we still can't escape the truth that every act of cleanliness is born from something unclean. We polish, we perfume, we flush, but we are still, fundamentally, creatures of flesh, and though we have traded moss for microfibers and buckets for pipes, the same fragile, embarrassing reality remains. Even language conspires to keep the subject at arm's length. We say restroom or washroom instead of what it truly is. We decorate it with flowers, hang art on the walls, play music through hidden speakers, anything to disguise the fact that, behind every scented candle and chrome handle, the same ancient act takes place, as universal as breathing and as inescapable as time. Perhaps that's why, when archaeologists unearth old latrines or broken pots, they handle them with the same reverence as relics, because they know that these small private traces tell us more about how people lived and how they saw themselves than any crown or sword ever could. The story of wiping, absurd as it may sound, is not just a story of hygiene, it's the story of shame and pride, of progress and denial, of how humans have spent thousands of years trying to refine what they could never truly escape, their own nature. And somewhere, in the quiet hum of a modern bathroom, with the faint scent of soap in the air, and the sound of running water behind the tiles, one can almost hear the echo of those ancient voices, Greek philosophers and Roman engineers, Chinese papermakers and Tudor courtiers, all whispering across the centuries, we too were human. For all its silence and secrecy, the toilet has shaped civilization more profoundly than any monument or war. It is the invisible cornerstone of cities, the quiet guardian of public health, and perhaps humanity's most overlooked triumph. Without sanitation, no empire could endure, no city could breathe, and no modern life could exist in comfort or safety. The story of the toilet is, in truth, the story of order, of how humans learned to manage their own chaos. In the ancient world, the first true sanitation systems appeared not out of luxury, but out of necessity. The Indus Valley civilization, over 4,000 years ago, had brick drains running beneath their streets, a marvel so advanced that some modern towns still struggle to match its logic. In Rome, vast sewers like the Cloaca Maxima carried away the waste of an empire. Their tunnels, carved in stone and still intact today, murmured beneath the city like arteries, feeding its heartbeat of marble and fire. Yet even in all that grandeur, the act itself remained humble and communal, a line of stone seats, shoulder to shoulder, with no partitions, only conversation. The Roman citizen relieved himself in public as casually as he dined, a reminder that civilization and humility have always shared the same seat. When Rome fell, so too did its plumbing. Europe's cities grew dense and filthy, their waste flowing through gutters and into rivers. The stench of humanity became the scent of the Middle Ages. Epidemics followed like shadows, cholera, typhus, plague, spreading through streets where chamber pots were emptied from windows and refuse mingled with rain. The body became both sinner and victim, trapped in its own waste. Only with the rebirth of science and engineering in the 18th and 19th centuries did sanitation become salvation. As cities expanded, so did their sewers, long vaulted tunnels that stretched like cathedrals beneath the earth. In London, Joseph Bazalgette's vast system of underground brickwork turned the Thames from a cesspool into a river again, saving tens of thousands of lives. The city, once choking on its own filth, could finally breathe. It was one of humanity's quietest revolutions, not written in blood or ink, but in clean water and brick. By the dawn of the 20th century, the toilet was no longer a symbol of embarrassment but of modernity. It represented control, over disease, over odor, over the boundaries between what was seen and what was hidden. Governments invested fortunes to bring plumbing to every home. A nation's progress was measured, not just in its armies or libraries, but in how cleanly its citizens could live. Hygiene became patriotism, cleanliness became civilization itself. And yet as we pushed the boundaries of progress, even the toilet followed us into space. When the first astronauts left Earth, NASA's engineers faced a question as old as humanity itself: how do you go to the bathroom in zero gravity? It was a challenge that humbled even the most brilliant minds, for in the vacuum of space waste does not fall, it floats. Early astronauts resorted to plastic bags, awkward harnesses, and whispered humor. The official NASA transcripts, now archived in the Library of Congress, contain entire paragraphs delicately describing fecal containment procedures. But by the time the International Space Station became home to long-term crews, technology had evolved into something astonishing. Air suction toilets with sensors, airflow regulators and vacuum hoses, all designed to ensure that human dignity could survive even beyond the sky. A toilet orbiting Earth became a monument to our refusal to surrender to biology, proof that wherever we go, our plumbing must follow. There is something poetic in that. Every time an astronaut flushes, The sound travels through titanium walls and silent corridors, echoing the same instinct that once guided peasants to the fields and kings to their velvet stools. Civilization, it seems, has always been about finding ways to live cleanly among the mess. And so, the toilet, humble, invisible, unspoken, stands as one of humanity's greatest inventions. It links us all from pharaohs to peasants, from emperors to engineers, from marble thrones to orbiting capsules. The one invention that truly unites Earth and space is not the sword, not the smartphone, but the seat. As humanity stepped quietly into the digital age, surrounded by the glow of screens and the hum of invisible data, one might have thought that we had already reached the peak of comfort, that there was little left to perfect in the art of being clean. And yet, the bathroom, that small sanctuary of solitude, became the next frontier of innovation. The toilet, once carved in stone and wood, now gleamed in chrome and ceramic. It could sense motion, measure temperature, even analyze health. What had once been a bucket in a corner had become a miniature laboratory, humming softly in the privacy of our homes. Engineers began to imagine toilets that could detect illness before symptoms appeared, devices that monitored hydration, glucose levels, or infection simply through what we left behind. The groom of the stool, long vanished from royal courts, had been reborn in silicon and sensors, and alongside this revolution came the quiet rise of the bidet, once considered a European curiosity, a porcelain basin hidden in the corner of 19th century bathrooms. It re-emerged in sleek, digital form, especially in Japan and South Korea, where it evolved into a marvel of modern hygiene. Nozzles adjusted by microchips, water warmed to precise temperatures, drying fans that whispered like summer breezes. The future of wiping, it seemed, was not wiping at all. Toilet paper, that proud symbol of the industrial age, began to lose its throne. Environmentalists pointed out that billions of trees were felled each year, just to manufacture what humanity used once and threw away. Each roll, soft and fragrant, carried a cost: forests stripped, rivers polluted, and carbon released. It was a strange irony that our obsession with cleanliness had dirtied the planet. And so the conversation shifted, from luxury to sustainability. Startups emerged, offering reusable wipes, biodegradable rolls, bamboo paper, and water-based cleansing systems. In some cities, people began installing bidet attachments as an act of quiet rebellion against the wastefulness of the modern roll. It was, in its own way, the most polite revolution imaginable, fought not with banners, but with plumbing. Still, even in the midst of progress, there was resistance. For many, toilet paper was not just a product, it was habit, comfort, and culture. Generations had grown up with it. Its disappearance felt like the loss of an old ritual. Marketers understood this, and responded with poetry. Rolls became scented, embossed, quilted, and packaged in designs so elegant they could have passed for pastries. Some brands even released limited editions, as if the simple act of wiping could become collectible. Meanwhile, in the laboratories of design, prototypes appeared that would have astonished even the engineers of the space age. Self-cleaning toilets with ultraviolet sterilization, robotic arms designed for hospitals and nursing homes, voice-controlled seats that adjusted to one's preferences with a soft chime. One company even unveiled an AI-powered toilet that could remember its user, adjusting the seat height, water temperature, and drying time like a digital butler for the most human of needs. It is a strange kind of progress, intimate, invisible, and yet profoundly telling. For thousands of years, humans have tried to separate themselves from their own nature, to turn necessity into comfort, discomfort into ritual, ritual into pride. Every innovation, from the sponge stick to the scented wipe, has been an attempt to master the same small moment that unites all of us. And yet, perhaps what makes this future so fascinating is not the technology itself, but the quiet humility behind it. Even in an age of machines, we are still designing ways to care for the most vulnerable part of being human. We still crave softness, warmth, and dignity, not as luxuries but as reminders that progress is not about escaping the body, but respecting it. It is said that civilization begins where people learn to keep clean, but perhaps its true measure is how gently we manage the mess, not just the physical one, but the endless balancing act between pride and humility, privacy and invention, the body and the world. The toilet of the future may glow, sing, and analyze our health, but it will always whisper the same quiet truth that every peasant, king, monk, and astronaut has known before, that no matter how far we rise, or how high we build, we are still, gloriously, humbly, human. For all our inventions and perfumes, all our pipes and porcelain, it is impossible to speak of cleanliness without also speaking of shame. Somewhere deep in the folds of civilization, the act of washing became entangled with morality, as if purity of skin could reflect purity of soul. What began as a simple instinct for survival turned into a complex theater of guilt and pride, where being clean was not just about health, but about who you were allowed to be. From the very beginning, human beings have lived with this paradox. The same body that gives life also produces waste. The same hands that create art must, at some point, serve nature's most humbling demands. Ancient philosophers understood this contradiction, and treated it with a strange reverence. The Stoics, for instance, believed that shame was not in the act itself, but in pretending to be above it. To live according to nature, they said, was to accept that even kings must crouch like common men. But religion changed the tone. In medieval Europe, the body became a battlefield between purity and sin. The church preached cleanliness of the soul, but often distrusted cleanliness of the flesh. To wash too often was seen as vanity. To care too much for the body was to risk loving it. And yet, paradoxically, saints and monks alike maintained rituals of ablution, washing hands, face and feet before prayer, as acts of humility, not pride. The water that washed away dirt symbolized repentance, and every droplet became a silent sermon about the fragility of the human form. In later centuries, as science replaced superstition, the obsession with purity merely changed its vocabulary. Cleanliness became hygiene, filth became infection, and priests gave way to doctors. The confession booth was replaced by the bathroom mirror. But the ritual remained the same. We continued to wash, to cleanse, to hide the evidence of our nature, hoping that by polishing the body, we might somehow quiet the spirit. There is a quiet sadness in that idea, that we have spent millennia trying to erase what makes us alive. We hide smells, we silence sounds, we sanitize touch, we build devices to distance ourselves from what our ancestors faced with bare hands and resignation. And in doing so, we have made cleanliness a kind of armor, a mask against the truth that all flesh, no matter how perfumed, will one day return to dust. Yet, beneath all the soap and steel, there lingers something more tender, a yearning for dignity. The act of cleaning is not merely denial, it is also care. A mother washing her child, a nurse tending to the sick, a monk rinsing his hands before breaking bread. Each gesture is a small declaration that even in a world of decay, we choose to preserve beauty. The basin becomes a sanctuary, the towel, a benediction. Modern psychology tells us that shame is the price of self-awareness, that to know we are unclean is to know we exist. Perhaps that is why every culture, from the deserts of Arabia to the snowfields of Scandinavia, has developed its own rites of washing. The ritual bath, the steam house, the sacred spring. We wash not only to remove dirt, but to reaffirm our belonging, to say, I am still worthy to be touched, to be seen, to begin again. In this way, the story of wiping, absurd and earthy as it seems, becomes something almost sacred. It is the constant negotiation between what is animal and what is divine, between the part of us that eats and bleeds and sweats, and the part that dreams of being clean forever. Every basin, every roll, every drop of water carries within it that fragile hope, that maybe if we are careful enough, gentle enough, disciplined enough, we can momentarily hold back the chaos of life. And though we laugh at the thought of medieval courtiers tending to the royal backside, or peasants crouched in fields of snow, their gestures were not so different from ours. They, too, sought grace in the mess, order in the body, peace in the simple rhythm of cleansing and beginning again. Civilization, at its heart, is nothing more than our shared attempt to stay clean in a dirty world, to keep the candle burning above the basin, even as the night around us never truly ends. For most of history, the human body was treated like a secret, something to be hidden, controlled, and spoken of only in whispers. It was a vessel for the soul, but also a reminder of the soul's imprisonment. Its needs were seen as base, its functions as embarrassing, and yet, quietly, within the steam of a bathhouse, or the solitude of a small wooden privy, people found moments of peace, moments when they were not kings or peasants, saints or sinners, but simply human. In those moments, washing or wiping, or tending to the body became something more than hygiene. It became intimacy, not the intimacy of lovers, but the kind that exists between the self and its own fragility, a private recognition that this body, flawed and temporary, is all we have to carry us through the world. Every act of cleaning, every gesture of care, was a small act of mercy toward oneself. Modern society often mistakes intimacy for exposure. We live in a world that celebrates the image of the body, but still hides its reality. We post pictures of perfection and filter out the truth, that the same bodies which glow on screens must still kneel before the same quiet porcelain altars each morning. We have not escaped our humanity, we've only learned to edit it. But there is something quietly noble in remembering what we are. The history of wiping, strange, comic, even grotesque, reminds us that humility is the foundation of civilization. Every polished marble bathroom, every gleaming faucet, every scented candle that flickers beside a sink exists because our ancestors dared to face what we now refuse to name. They learned to make peace with their bodies instead of denying them. In ancient Japan, the onsen, the hot spring, was not just a place to clean the skin but to cleanse the spirit. Strangers bathed side by side, old and young, rich and poor, their differences melting away in the warmth of the water. The Romans, too, built vast bathhouses not only for sanitation but for conversation, reflection and communion. To wash together was to be equal, naked, vulnerable, human. Today, that sense of ritual has faded, replaced by the hurried solitude of modern life. We shut the door, turn the lock, and rush through what our ancestors once treated as sacred. Yet, deep down, the act still carries the same meaning. The moment we run water over our hands, or wipe a face clean of sweat or tears, we perform a quiet ceremony of renewal. We are, for an instant, both priest and penitent, body and soul, washing away the dust of living to begin again. The groom of the stool, the medieval peasants, the Roman engineers, the paper makers of China, all of them played their part in this strange unbroken chain of tenderness and necessity. Their world was filled with odors, stains and imperfection, yet also with care, ingenuity, and love disguised as duty. Even in the most humiliating tasks, there was a kind of holiness, an understanding that to serve the body was to honor life itself. Perhaps that is the true secret of this long and ridiculous history, that there is beauty even in what we hide. Every basin of water, every folded towel, every piece of soft paper is a confession that the body is fragile, yes, but worth preserving. We build empires, cross oceans, and fly to the stars, and still, at the end of the day, we return to the same small ritual, the cleansing of what is mortal. It is the most democratic act of all, the one thing no one can delegate, no one can escape, and no one can perfect. In the silence of that ritual, the walls of class and power dissolve. The peasant, the king, the emperor, and the astronaut, all bow before the same truth, that life, for all its grandeur, is maintained by the smallest, simplest acts of care. And maybe that is what civilization really is, not our buildings, nor our conquests, nor our inventions, but our willingness to tend to what is humble, to show kindness to what is fragile, to keep ourselves, and one another, just a little cleaner than the chaos we come from. When you look back across the centuries, from the moss of the Middle Ages to the porcelain glow of modern bathrooms, it becomes clear that the story of cleanliness has never been about vanity. It has always been about peace, about finding for a moment a kind of stillness within the chaos of flesh and history. Every basin, every stream, every folded towel tells the same story, that to be human is to be temporary, and that the only real luxury we have is the chance to care for what will not last. The act of cleaning, no matter how small, is an act of hope, a belief that tomorrow can begin fresh, that decay can be delayed, that we can somehow polish the brief candle of our existence just a little brighter before it burns away. In the soft rhythm of washing, wiping and cleansing, humanity found its most universal prayer. It was not carved in stone nor sung in cathedrals, but whispered through repetition, the daily renewal of the body, the silent conversation between skin and water. Whether it was a peasant dipping his hands into a bucket before dinner, or a monarch perfuming his chamber before dawn, the gesture was the same. I am still here. I will care for this fragile vessel a little longer. Over time, that instinct for care became the foundation of entire civilizations. The aqueducts of Rome, the bathhouses of Istanbul, the sewers of London, all were built not merely for comfort, but for mercy. They were monuments to the quiet human refusal to live in filth, to accept suffering as destiny. Beneath all the architecture of power and faith, it was hygiene that truly held society together, invisible, uncelebrated, but essential. And yet, there is something almost poetic in how it has all come full circle. In the beginning, people cleaned themselves with the materials of the earth, moss, snow, water, and wind. After thousands of years of invention, of paper and plumbing and perfumed soaps, we are returning once again to the natural: bamboo, rainwater, sustainability, simplicity, as if, at the end of all our progress, we finally remembered that the earth itself was always our first bathroom, and our first forgiveness. The human body, for all its indignities, remains a miracle of endurance. It bends, breaks, heals, and remembers. It demands care not as a weakness, but as a form of wisdom. To clean it is not to deny its messiness, but to accept it, to honor it. Every gesture of cleanliness, no matter how mundane, is a kind of tenderness toward the self, and perhaps that is why, throughout history, every civilization has found a way to turn cleanliness into ritual. Whether it was a medieval monk washing his hands before prayer, or a modern worker stepping into a hot shower after a long day, the impulse is the same: to wash away the noise, the fatigue, the burden of being alive, to find, even for a minute, the quiet sound of water, and the soft feeling of renewal. It is easy to laugh at the absurdities of the past: the grooms of the stool, the shared Roman sponges, the perfumed scrolls of Chinese emperors, yet each of them, in their own time, was simply trying to do what we still do today: to live with dignity in a body that refuses to be perfect. And maybe that is the true legacy of cleanliness. Not the gleaming tiles, nor the scented paper, but the understanding that we are all the same: soft, flawed, mortal. That behind every locked door, every curtain, every ritual of washing, there beats the same quiet desire to be at peace within the skin we inhabit. So much of human history has been about conquering land, nature, even our own impulses. But perhaps the greatest act of civilization is not conquest at all, but acceptance. To wash the body, to care for it, to forgive it. This is how humanity learned to live with itself. In the end, the story of wiping, absurd, intimate, and strangely profound, is not really about toilets or towels, or even about kings and peasants. It is about the quiet grace of being human, about the thousand small gestures that keep our fragile world from falling into chaos. The sweep of a cloth, the pour of water, the turning of a handle, the folding of clean linen. Across all the ages, through war and famine, plague and empire, we have never stopped caring for the same simple task. Even as civilizations collapsed and were rebuilt, as languages changed and gods were renamed, the rhythm of cleansing endured. It was the pulse of continuity, a small act repeated so faithfully that it outlived kingdoms and ideologies alike. There is a strange kind of holiness in that, the holiness of maintenance, of quiet duty, of love disguised as routine. We are taught to admire heroes and martyrs, kings and conquerors, but perhaps the truest measure of civilization lies not in their monuments, but in the soft invisible hands that kept the world clean while no one watched. Somewhere in a medieval palace, a man once knelt beside a king with a towel and a bowl of rose water. In a Roman bathhouse, steam rose from marble as strangers laughed and washed away the day. In a snowbound peasant's hut, a mother wiped her child's face by firelight. And in a space station orbiting far above the clouds, a whisper of air carries away what the body no longer needs. Different worlds, same gesture, the endless choreography of care. Perhaps that is what makes humanity beautiful. Not perfection, but persistence, the refusal to abandon grace, even in the most humiliating acts of survival, the will to turn necessity into tenderness, to find, even in the dirt, a reason to keep polishing. Cleanliness, in the end, is not about fear of filth, it is about faith in renewal. It is the hope that no matter how dark or chaotic life becomes, there will always be water to wash with, light to see by, and a small moment each day when the world feels new again. So tonight, as you lie in your bed, beneath the quiet hum of your own century, think of the long chain of lives that led here: the grooms, the peasants, the monks, the inventors, the engineers. All of them, in their own way, fought the same battle against decay, and all of them, without knowing it, built something sacred from the simplest truth, that to care for the body is to honor the soul that lives inside it. The candle flickers, the water still runs, the centuries pass like breath, and through it all the human story continues, messy, marvelous, and endlessly cleanable.